The shadow in the hallway. A young woman named Tara recently moved into an older apartment building in Chicago. She was thrilled to finally be living alone, but her excitement quickly gave way to unease. Every night, around 3 a.m., she would hear slow, shuffling footsteps in the hallway outside her bedroom door. The sound would linger for several minutes before fading, but each night it got closer, as if someone were gradually making their way toward her room. One night, determined to catch whatever was making the noise, Tara left her bedroom door slightly open. She waited, phone in hand, ready to record what she saw. At exactly 3 a.m., the footsteps started again, slow and heavy, scraping along the floor. As they neared her door, a dark shape appeared, just a shadow, darker than the rest of the room, but it was clearly the outline of a person. She froze, heart pounding, as the shadow paused at her door, filling the crack of light spilling from the hallway. It seemed to stretch, elongated fingers reaching across the threshold, just a breath away from her. She held her breath, praying it would go away. And then, just as suddenly as it had arrived, the shadow vanished. But when she replayed the video, there was no sound of footsteps, only a low, whispering voice repeating her name over and over. Tara moved out that very week, but sometimes she swears she still hears those footsteps at night. The old man on the road. Driving late at night can be eerie, especially on desolate country roads. Jack, a delivery driver, often found himself out on the road well past midnight. One October night, he was on his usual route through rural Pennsylvania when he saw an old man standing by the side of the road, waving him down. Jack was surprised to see anyone out there, especially an elderly man with no car or visible means of transportation. But the man looked distressed, so he pulled over. The old man approached and asked Jack for a ride to the next town. He had a deep, raspy voice that made the hairs on the back of Jack's neck stand up, but Jack agreed. The man climbed in, his breath cold and damp, filling the small truck cab with an almost unbearable chill. They drove in silence for several miles before the old man suddenly spoke. "You need to be careful out here," he said, voice gravelly. "Not everyone you pick up will be as friendly as me." Jack forced a laugh, but the old man didn't join in. Instead, he turned to look directly at Jack, his eyes pale and clouded, like something was growing inside them. Jack's grip on the wheel tightened, and he sped up, eager to reach the next town. Then, as he turned to assure the old man they were almost there, the seat beside him was empty. The old man had vanished, leaving behind only a faint, icy mist that slowly dissolved into the night. To this day, Jack still refuses to pick up hitchhikers. The basement door. In 2024, Ben and his girlfriend Sarah moved into an old house in upstate New York, eager to renovate it and make it their own. The house had a basement with a door that wouldn't quite close, no matter how hard they tried. They chalked it up to the house settling and didn't think much of it. But then, strange things began to happen. Ben would come home to find the basement door wide open, despite them both being sure they had closed it that morning. Sometimes he would hear a faint whispering coming from downstairs when he was alone. Other times, it was a quiet, persistent tapping sound, almost like someone was trying to get out. One night, Sarah had a nightmare. She dreamed of a figure, shrouded in shadows, standing at the foot of their bed, whispering. When she woke up, she could still hear the whispering and saw the basement door slowly opening, even though no one was there. Ben grabbed a flashlight, determined to find the source of the noise. As they descended the creaky stairs, they were greeted by a foul, rotting smell that seemed to grow stronger with each step. At the bottom, they found nothing, just a damp, empty basement. But as they turned to leave, they heard the basement door creak shut, locking them inside. They banged on the door, but no one came. It was hours before they managed to break out. The next day, they moved out, leaving the house and its secrets behind. The doll in the woods. 8-year-old Mia found the doll while playing in the woods behind her family's new home in Vermont. It was an old porcelain doll, dressed in faded Victorian clothing, with glassy blue eyes that seemed to stare right through you. Maya brought it inside, thrilled with her discovery, but her parents were less than pleased. They felt uneasy about the doll, but Mia insisted on keeping it. That night, Mia's mother woke up to the sound of soft, childlike giggles echoing through the house. She went to check on her daughter, but found her room empty, the window wide open. Frantically, she searched the house, finally finding Maya standing in the kitchen, clutching the doll to her chest. When asked what she was doing, Maya replied she wanted to go outside. Over the next few nights, Mia's behavior grew stranger. She spoke to the doll constantly, whispering in her room long after bedtime. One night, Mia's father decided to take the doll and throw it into the woods, hoping to put an end to the eerie behavior. But the next morning, the doll was back, sitting on the porch with dirt smeared across its porcelain cheeks as if it had crawled back. They moved out shortly after, but neighbors claim they still hear childlike giggles coming from the woods at night. The man in the mirror. Sophie had just started a new job in a high-rise building in downtown Seattle. The office was beautiful, with floor-to-ceiling windows and mirrors on almost every wall. One evening, as she worked late, she glanced into one of the mirrors and saw a man standing behind her, staring directly into her eyes. Startled, she turned around, but no one was there. Her heart raced as she looked back into the mirror, only to see that the man was gone. Dismissing it as a trick of the light, Sophie continued working, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. The next night, she saw him again, only this time he was closer. She could see his face clearly now, pale, hollow eyes, and a twisted grin that seemed to mock her. Again she turned, and again no one was there. But this time she noticed something chilling. Her reflection didn't match her movements. As she raised her hand to her face, her reflection simply stared, unmoving. Panic surged through her, and she fled the building, never returning. But in the weeks that followed, Sophie swore she could catch glimpses of the man in other mirrors, in her apartment, in store windows, even in her car's rearview mirror. He was always there, grinning, waiting. She smashed every mirror she owned, but she knew it was only a matter of time before he found her again. The room that disappeared. David and Emma bought an old fixer-upper in rural Georgia, thrilled with the potential of the large, sprawling property. But as they were renovating, they stumbled upon a hidden door in the attic. Curious, they forced it open and found a small, cramped room filled with old furniture and a thick layer of dust, as if it hadn't been touched in decades. Strangely, there was a strong smell of flowers mixed with something rotten. They decided to leave the room alone for now, planning to go back later. But when they returned the next day, the door was gone. In its place was a solid wall with no sign a door had ever been there. They thought it was a bizarre trick of the mind, perhaps a result of the old house settling, and dismissed it as a strange coincidence. One night, as they lay in bed, they heard the sound of muffled voices coming from above. It sounded like children whispering, giggling, as though playing hide and seek. David went up to investigate but found nothing, just empty space where the door had been. Yet, as he turned to leave, he caught a whiff of that same sickly sweet smell. Over the following weeks, the whispers grew louder, and sometimes they could hear faint scratching sounds as if someone, or something, was trying to claw its way out. They tried to sell the house, but every time a potential buyer toured it, they would hear those same sounds. In the end, David and Emma simply left, abandoning the house and its secrets to whatever might still be lurking in that hidden room. The face in the window. Chris lived alone in a small 2-story house at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. One rainy night, he was sitting on the couch watching TV when he caught a glimpse of something in the corner of his eye, a face staring at him through the window. Startled, he turned to look, but it was gone. Figuring it was just his imagination, he brushed it off. A few nights later, he saw it again. This time, the face was pressed up against the glass, features distorted, eyes wide and unblinking. It vanished the moment he looked directly at it, leaving him unsettled but convinced it was a trick of the light. But it kept happening, each time getting closer and staying longer. Soon he could make out the face clearly, a woman with pale skin and hollow eyes, her mouth stretched in a grin far too wide for comfort. He installed blinds, but every so often he would catch a glimpse of her peeking through the slats, waiting. One night he woke up to find her standing in his bedroom, staring down at him, the same twisted grin frozen on her face. He screamed, and she faded into the shadows, leaving him to wonder if she'd been real or just another nightmare. But every time he closed his eyes, he could still see her there, watching, waiting for the right moment to return. The voice in the vent. When Lily moved into her new apartment in Los Angeles, everything seemed perfect, great location, modern amenities, and an unbeatable view. But almost immediately, she began hearing a voice coming from the air vent in her bedroom. At first, it was just faint mumbling, something she could easily ignore. But over time, the voice grew clearer, almost as if someone were trying to have a conversation with her. One night, she pressed her ear to the vent and listened. The voice was soft, whispering her name in a breathy tone, over and over again. Terrified, she called the building management, who assured her that the ventilation system was old and noises were normal. They said they'd send someone to check it out, but no one ever came. Lily decided to record the sound one night, hoping to prove it to the building staff. But when she played back the recording, she heard something else, a low, menacing voice that said, "I'm coming." She threw her phone across the room, horrified, and spent the rest of the night wide awake, staring at the vent. The next morning, she packed up and left. A few days later, she learned that the previous tenant had gone missing under mysterious circumstances. No one had ever found her, but some of the other tenants claimed to still hear her voice in the vents, whispering, calling for help, as if she were trapped somewhere in the walls. The Watcher in the Woods. Megan's family owned a cabin deep in the woods of Maine, a place they'd visit every fall for a peaceful retreat. This year, she went alone, looking forward to some solitude and a break from her hectic life. But from the moment she arrived, she felt uneasy, as if someone or something was watching her. On the second night, she saw something out the window. Standing at the edge of the tree line was a tall, dark figure, watching the cabin with glowing amber eyes. She quickly turned off the lights, heart racing, and peeked out from behind the curtains. The figure hadn't moved, but it seemed closer than before, almost as if it were gliding towards her. She spent the night huddled in bed, listening to the sound of footsteps outside, circling the cabin, and a soft, almost rhythmic tapping at the windows. In the morning, she found strange footprints in the mud surrounding the cabin, larger than any animal she knew of and unmistakably human. She cut her trip short and left the cabin, vowing never to return. Locals later told her stories of an ancient spirit that roamed the woods, watching over trespassers, following them, even driving some to madness. To this day, she can't shake the feeling that the Watcher followed her home, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to appear once more. The Haunted Elevator. Jackson worked as a security guard for an old hotel in New Orleans, a place known for its ghost stories and haunted history. But he never experienced anything unusual until one Halloween night when he was working the overnight shift. The elevator started going up and down on its own, doors opening and closing at random floors, even though no one was inside. He chalked it up to a malfunction and ignored it. But then, around 2 a.m., he heard a child's laughter echoing through the empty lobby. The sound seemed to come from inside the elevator. When he checked the security cameras, he saw a small girl in a white dress standing in the elevator, staring directly into the camera with wide, unblinking eyes. He ran to the elevator, but when he got there, it was empty. The lights flickered and the doors closed, leaving him standing alone in the hallway. As he turned to leave, he felt a small, icy hand grasp his arm, pulling him back towards the elevator. He turned, but no one was there. He quit the next day, but people who work there still report hearing the girl's laughter echoing through the halls long after midnight. The Whispering Forest. In a small town in Oregon, there is a local legend about a forest where people often go missing, never to be seen again. Emily and her friends decided to explore it one Halloween night, hoping to debunk the myth. They wandered deep into the forest, laughing and joking, until they realized they were hopelessly lost. As night fell, they began hearing whispers all around them, voices calling their names, each one more desperate than the last. They tried to follow the sounds, hoping to find a way out, but the whispers seemed to lead them in circles, always back to the same spot, a large twisted tree with deep, claw-like marks gouged into its bark. One by one, Emily's friends disappeared, swallowed by the darkness. Panicking, she stumbled through the woods alone, feeling unseen hands brush against her arms and face, pulling her back toward the tree. Finally, as dawn broke, she found her way out, but her friends were never seen again. And to this day, she swears she can still hear their voices calling to her, begging for help, from deep within the forest. The Flickering Candle. Lana was spending Halloween night alone in a small rental cabin nestled in the woods of Vermont. She brought candles to add a little cozy ambience to her solo retreat and had one large candle on the coffee table as she read a book. As the evening wore on, she noticed the candle flickering strangely, almost as if it were responding to an unseen draft. But when she got up to check, there were no windows open and the doors were locked. Lana returned to her book, but the flickering became more erratic, as though someone were waving a hand back and forth over the flame. Uneasy, she snuffed it out. To her surprise, the candle flickered back to life almost immediately, the flame taller and brighter than before. A soft, raspy whisper filled the room, too faint to understand but distinctly malevolent. Lana stood frozen, watching as the flame twisted and bent, forming what looked like a green face in the candle's light. She tried to blow it out again, but this time the flame refused to die, flaring up even brighter. It felt as though something was watching her, feeding off her fear. In a panic, she grabbed her bag and fled the cabin. When she looked back from a distance, the entire room was aglow, illuminated by the flame of a single candle, flickering wildly. Lana never returned, but when the owner came to check on the cabin a few days later, he found a melted candle in the shape of a human face on the coffee table. The Haunted Hospital. Jake worked the night shift as a janitor at an abandoned hospital scheduled for demolition in a few weeks. Most of the building had already been gutted, but his job was to keep it secure until the demolition was complete. One Halloween night, as he was mopping the empty halls, he began to hear faint, echoing cries. He dismissed them, thinking it was just the old pipes or his imagination playing tricks on him. But as he moved to the next floor, he saw movement out of the corner of his eye. Turning, he found a gurney slowly rolling down the hallway, even though the building was completely sealed from any breeze. He walked over to stop it, but as soon as his hand touched the gurney, the lights flickered and a chill ran down his spine. The distant sound of a heartbeat monitor filled the air, even though the power had been cut to that part of the building. A door at the end of the hall creaked open, revealing an empty operating room. Inside, he could hear the faint murmur of voices, doctors discussing a surgery in clinical tones. Then he saw it, a shadowy figure lying on the operating table, surrounded by other shadows moving around it, their voices rising and falling as they performed a grisly, ghostly operation. He backed away, but the shadows turned, their hollow eyes following him as he stumbled back down the hall. He ran out of the hospital and quit that night, but those who came to demolish the building claimed they could still hear the echo of voices and the steady, ghostly beeping of a heart monitor deep within the walls. The dolls of Room 24. At a small, family-run hotel in the heart of Louisiana, there is a room that no one dares enter. Room 24 has been locked for years, but every so often, guests will report hearing soft, childlike giggles coming from behind its door. The owners always wave it off as local legend, until one Halloween night, when a guest staying in the adjacent room decided to investigate. The guest, curious and armed with nothing but a flashlight, pried the door open and stepped inside. The room was dusty, with a faint smell of mildew, but the floor was lined with old dolls, hundreds of them, their glass eyes reflecting the beam of his flashlight. They were arranged in a circle, all facing the center of the room where a single larger doll sat on a chair, wearing a yellowed lace dress and a faded bonnet. As he approached, the doll's eyes seemed to follow him, and a strange pressure built in his chest. Then he heard it, a soft giggle, and the dolls' heads began to turn, one by one, in unison. The large doll in the chair tilted its head, and its lips parted, revealing tiny yellowed teeth. It whispered, "Stay with us." Panicking, he turned to run, but the door slammed shut, and he felt tiny hands grasping at his ankles, cold fingers wrapping around his legs, pulling him back toward the circle. He managed to break free, running from the room and leaving the hotel without looking back. No one ever goes into Room 24 anymore, but sometimes guests can still hear the faint giggles and the soft, scraping sound of doll heads turning in the dark. The figure on the stairs. Ivan moved into an old townhouse in Boston, unaware of the building's dark history. Every night, he'd hear soft footsteps on the stairs leading to his bedroom. At first, he thought it was just the creaking of old wood, but soon the footsteps became more distinct, always pausing right outside his door. He would listen, heart racing, but there would never be anyone there. One night, he heard the footsteps again, slow and deliberate. He called out, but there was no response. Gathering his courage, he opened the door and was met with the sight of a shadowy figure standing at the bottom of the stairs, looking up at him with hollow, empty eyes. As he blinked, the figure began to ascend, each step slow and calculated. Even stumbled back, shutting the door and bracing himself against it, but he could feel the cold seeping through the wood. A deep, rasping voice echoed through the door, whispering his name over and over. In desperation, he bolted from the house and never returned. Later, he learned that the previous occupant had fallen down the stairs to their death, and rumors said that their spirit lingered forever climbing the stairs in search of peace. To this day, people passing by the townhouse claim to see a shadowy figure in the window, staring out as if waiting for something or someone to come home. The hands under the bed. Katie had always been afraid of the dark, but when she moved into a new apartment, she decided it was time to face her fears. She'd heard a few strange noises her first few nights, but nothing she couldn't handle until one Halloween night when she awoke to the feeling of something cold brushing against her hand as it dangled off the bed. Assuming it was just the fabric of her sheets, she ignored it and drifted back to sleep. But then she felt it again, this time a firm, icy grip, squeezing her fingers tightly. Her heart raced as she pulled her hand away and turned on the light. Nothing was there. Trying to calm herself, she lay back down, but as she closed her eyes, she felt something brush against her feet, as if fingers were running along her toes. She sat up, paralyzed with fear, and stared down at the edge of the bed. Gathering her courage, she peeked under it and saw two pale, bony hands reaching up, fingertips stretching out to grab her. She screamed and the hands vanished, but every night after that, she slept with the lights on, terrified that one night she might wake up to find the hands holding onto her once again. The watchful portrait. Alec inherited an old mansion from a distant relative, a place he'd never visited but was excited to explore. The house was filled with dusty old furniture and strange, antique portraits hanging on every wall. One painting in particular caught his attention, a large, imposing portrait of a woman with piercing blue eyes and a solemn expression. As he wandered the halls, he couldn't shake the feeling that the woman's eyes followed him, watching his every move. He tested his theory, walking from one end of the room to the other, and sure enough, her gaze seemed to track him. Dismissing it as a trick of the light, he continued exploring, but the unsettling feeling stayed with him. That night, he awoke to find the portrait hanging directly across from his bed, even though he remembered seeing it in the hallway earlier. As he stared at the painting, the woman's expression slowly changed, her lips curling into a sinister smile, her eyes narrowing as if she knew a terrible secret. He tried to take the painting down the next morning, but no matter how hard he pulled, it wouldn't budge. He left the mansion that day, unable to sleep with those watchful eyes upon him. After he moved out, neighbors reported seeing the woman's face peering out from the windows, her cold eyes watching anyone who dared to approach. The cold room. A small bed and breakfast in England has a room that no one ever wants to stay in. Known as the cold room, it's always inexplicably freezing, even in the middle of summer. Guests who have braved the room claim to feel a constant chill, along with an overwhelming sense of dread. One Halloween, a young couple checked in, unaware of the room's reputation. They immediately noticed the temperature drop and an oppressive heaviness in the air. The lights flickered constantly, and they heard faint, muffled sobs coming from the walls. When they decided to leave, they found that the door wouldn't open. No matter how hard they pulled, it felt as if something were holding it shut. The sobbing grew louder, joined by a low, agonizing wail, and a shadow began to form in the corner of the room, growing darker and more solid with each passing second. Finally, the door flung open and they fled. Later, they learned that a woman had died in that room decades ago, locked in by her abusive husband. Her spirit is said to linger, forever reliving her final moments, reaching out to anyone who dares to spend the night in the cold room. The phantom phone call. Liz was a college student living in a cramped apartment near campus. One night, as she was cramming for midterms, her phone rang, displaying a number she didn't recognize. She ignored it, thinking it was just a wrong number. But then it rang again and again. Each time she picked up, there was only silence on the other end, followed by a faint static that sounded almost like breathing. After the fourth call, she decided to block the number. But the calls kept coming, each one from a new, unknown number. It wasn't until the eighth call that she finally heard a voice, a low, gravelly whisper that said, "I can see you." Her heart pounding, she looked around her apartment, but there was no one there. She closed her curtains, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched, but the calls continued, each one more insistent than the last, always with the same message, "I can see you." When she went to the police, they traced the numbers, only to discover that the calls were coming from her own phone number. Terrified, Liz threw her phone away. But that night, she woke up to the sound of a faint, static-filled whisper coming from the darkness of her bedroom. "I can see you." The mirror in the attic. Dylan inherited his grandmother's old house after she passed away. While cleaning out the attic, he found an antique mirror, large and heavy, with a tarnished silver frame. Curious, he decided to hang it in his bedroom, admiring the way it gave the room an old-fashioned charm. But strange things began to happen after that. Every night, he would catch glimpses of movement in the mirror out of the corner of his eye. When he looked directly at it, nothing was there. One night, as he was lying in bed, he glanced at the mirror and saw a shadowy figure standing in the reflection, watching him. He sat up, heart racing, but when he looked directly at the mirror, the figure was gone. He tried to ignore it, telling himself it was just his imagination, but each night the figure grew clearer. Soon he could make out details, a man with sunken eyes and a sinister grin, his hands pressed against the glass as if trying to push through. Dylan decided to cover the mirror with a sheet, but in the morning, the sheet was always pulled away, lying crumpled on the floor. One night, he woke up to find the man from the mirror standing at the foot of his bed, his face inches away, a cold hand pressing down on his chest. He screamed, and the figure vanished, but the next morning, the mirror was cracked, a single handprint etched into the glass. He moved out that same day, leaving the mirror, and whatever was inside it, behind. The night bus. Mark had missed his usual train and decided to catch the late-night bus to get home. The bus was empty except for a few passengers scattered across the seats, each one staring straight ahead, unmoving. He took a seat near the back and settled in for the long ride, trying to ignore the eerie silence. As the bus rolled through the dark streets, he noticed that the passengers around him didn't seem quite right. Their skin was pale, their clothes old-fashioned, and their eyes were wide and unblinking. One by one, they turned to look at him, their faces expressionless, eyes empty and cold. The bus passed stop after stop, but no one got on or off. The driver, who hadn't moved since Mark boarded, seemed oblivious. Finally, Mark mustered the courage to ask where the bus was headed, but the driver didn't respond. Instead, one of the passengers turned to him, whispering, "It's too late now. You're one of us." The lights flickered, and when they came back on, Mark found himself alone on the bus, the other passengers gone. Panicked, he rushed to the front, but the bus was empty, the driver's seat vacant. The bus rolled to a stop at an unfamiliar street, and Mark stumbled off, finding himself back at the very station where he'd first boarded. The bus pulled away, fading into the darkness, and he never saw it, or the passengers, again. The haunted ring. Claire was browsing at an antique store when she found a beautiful silver ring, intricately carved with a strange symbol. She felt an inexplicable pull towards it and decided to buy it, slipping it onto her finger as she left the shop. That night, she began to have strange dreams. In them, she was wandering through an endless field of graves, each one bearing her name. As she passed each grave, shadowy hands would reach up, grasping for her, whispering in languages she didn't understand. She woke up in a cold sweat, only to find faint bruises on her arms, as if something had grabbed her in her sleep. The next day, she tried to take the ring off, but it was stuck, seeming to tighten every time she pulled at it. The shadows in her dreams grew darker, and she began seeing them during the day, dark figures lurking at the edge of her vision, always watching, always waiting. Desperate, she returned to the antique store, but the owner claimed he'd never seen the ring before and had no record of selling it to her. Panicking, she went to a jeweler, but they couldn't remove it, saying it was as if the ring had fused to her skin. Claire became withdrawn, tormented by the shadowy figures, and over time, she started to waste away, her health deteriorating as the ring seemed to drain the life from her. One night, she vanished, leaving behind nothing but a faint silver outline on her dresser where the ring had once rested. The ghost on the line. Jake was a 911 dispatcher used to getting strange calls, but one Halloween night, he received a call that chilled him to the bone. The voice on the other end was soft, trembling, as if from a young child. The boy said he was hiding under his bed because the man had come into his room. Jake asked for the boy's address, but the line went silent. Then the boy whispered, "He's getting closer." Jake heard the sound of footsteps, heavy and slow, approaching through the phone. He tried to keep the boy calm, asking for more information, but there was no response, just the soft sound of breathing, and then the line went dead. Rattled, Jake reported the call, but when he pulled up the address, he was stunned to find that the house had burned down over 20 years ago. A family had lived there, but the young boy had died in the fire, trapped in his bedroom. Every Halloween, other dispatchers reported similar calls, always from the same address, with the same soft, frightened voice on the other end of the line, whispering, "He's getting closer." The piano that played itself. In an old, abandoned theater in Detroit, there is a grand piano that plays itself. Legend has it that the theater's pianist died on stage during a performance decades ago, and her spirit lingers, tied to the instrument. One Halloween night, a group of teenagers broke into the theater, daring each other to see the haunted piano for themselves. They made their way to the stage, shining their flashlights over the dust-covered rows of seats. The piano stood in the center, its keys slightly yellowed, and a faint, eerie melody filled the room. As they watched, the keys began to move on their own, striking a hauntingly familiar tune. One of the teens tried to approach, but as he did, the melody grew louder, frantic, almost angry. Suddenly, the lid of the piano slammed shut, and a ghostly figure appeared, hovering above the instrument, her face twisted in sorrow and rage. She pointed a bony finger at them, her mouth opening in a silent scream, and the room filled with the sound of shattering glass as the theater lights exploded one by one. They'd fled, but every Halloween, people claimed to hear the same melody drifting from the abandoned theater, as if the ghostly pianist is still waiting for someone to join her on stage. The staircase to nowhere. In an old library on the outskirts of a small town, there is a staircase that leads to nowhere. Hidden behind a door labeled storage, the staircase is narrow, spiraling up and up with no end in sight. Most of the staff avoids it, but one Halloween night, a young librarian named Rebecca decided to explore it, hoping to uncover its secrets. She climbed, the air growing colder with each step, the light fading as she ascended. She soon realized that the staircase seemed endless, winding higher and higher, with no doors or landings in sight. Just as she began to feel lost, she heard footsteps echoing from above, slow and steady, descending toward her. Rebecca called out, but there was no response. She tried to turn back, but the stairs seemed different, twisting in impossible ways, leading her deeper into the darkness. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and she could feel a presence just beyond her reach, something unseen lurking in the shadows. She was never seen again, and the library has since closed off the door, leaving the staircase to its secrets. But every so often, the staff hears the faint sound of footsteps coming from beyond the locked door, as if someone, or something, is still wandering, lost in the darkness. The closed with the blue light. Cassie moved into a cozy, old-fashioned house on the outskirts of town, excited to have a place of her own. But on her first night, she noticed a faint blue light coming from the closet in her bedroom. She opened the door to investigate, only to find nothing but old wallpaper peeling from the walls and a musty smell that hinted at years of neglect. However, each night, the blue light returned, stronger and more intense. She tried ignoring it, but eventually, her curiosity got the better of her. She opened the closet one night to find a small, glowing object embedded in the wall, its faint blue light pulsating as if alive. She reached out to touch it, and the room instantly grew cold, her breath visible in the air. Suddenly, she heard a child's voice whisper, "Come closer." She recoiled, slamming the closet door shut, but the whispering continued, growing louder and more insistent each night. The blue light seeped through the cracks around the door, filling her room with an eerie glow. Cassie moved out shortly after, but she heard that the next tenant claimed to see the same light and hear the same chilling whispers. It seems that whatever is in the closet is still waiting for someone to come closer. The phantom child at the playground. Paul loved going for late-night walks, especially on cool autumn nights. One Halloween, he decided to stroll through the local park, passing by the small playground that was usually empty at night. But this time, he saw a young girl on the swings, her head hanging low, swinging slowly back and forth. He approached her, concerned, and asked if she was lost. The girl didn't respond, just kept swinging, her movements slow and mechanical. As he moved closer, he noticed that she was wearing a white dress, thin and tattered, and her skin had an almost translucent quality to it, glowing faintly in the moonlight. He reached out to touch her shoulder, and she suddenly looked up, her face pale and expressionless, her eyes empty black pits. She whispered, "Want to play with me?" before dissolving into a wisp of fog that drifted away on the breeze. Paul ran from the park, but every Halloween he swears he sees her swinging alone, waiting for someone to come play. The possessed painting. Ella was an artist with a passion for the strange and the macabre. She often visited thrift stores to find inspiration, and one Halloween she came across an old, battered painting of a dark forest, cloaked in fog. She was drawn to it immediately and bought it, planning to restore it and hang it in her studio. As she worked on the painting, strange things began to happen. Shadows seemed to stretch across her walls, and she would catch glimpses of figures moving within the trees in the painting. One night, as she was cleaning her brushes, she looked up to see a pair of glowing eyes staring back at her from the canvas. Horrified, she tried to cover the painting, but the eyes followed her, growing more intense, as if the figure were pushing against the frame, trying to break free. The room grew icy, and she could feel a dark presence behind her, breathing heavily. She abandoned her studio that night, leaving the painting behind. When she returned the next day, it was gone. Rumor has it that the painting reappears in various thrift stores, waiting for someone else to take it home, and those who do are never heard from again. The ghostly hitchhiker. Sam was driving home from a Halloween party, the road empty and bathed in an eerie mist. As he rounded a corner, he saw a figure standing by the side of the road, a woman in a long flowing dress, her face hidden by a hood. She raised a hand, motioning for him to stop. He pulled over, and she got into the back seat without a word. She looked cold, her skin almost blue, and he asked if she needed help. She simply nodded, staring out the window as he drove. After a few minutes, he looked in the rearview mirror, only to find the back seat empty. Startled, he pulled over, but there was no sign of her. Just as he was about to drive off, he felt a chill and heard her voice whisper from the back seat, "Thank you for the ride." He spun around, but the seat was still empty. Shaken, he drove home and learned later that a woman fitting her description had died on that very stretch of road years ago. Now she appears every Halloween, looking for a ride to her final destination. The figure in the fog. Melissa went for a run every morning through the foggy trails near her home. One morning, just before dawn, she saw a dark figure standing by the edge of the woods, barely visible through the mist. It looked like a man, tall and thin, dressed in dark clothing, his face hidden in shadow. She continued running, but each time she looked over her shoulder, the figure was there, always the same distance away, always watching. She picked up her pace. The faster she ran, the closer he seemed to get, until he was nearly beside her, his face turning slowly to reveal hollow, empty eyes and a crooked smile. She stumbled, falling to the ground, and when she looked up, he was gone, leaving nothing but a strange, swirling mist. She ran home, never daring to take that trail again. But sometimes, when she passes by the edge of the woods, she catches a glimpse of him standing there, waiting for someone else to run by. The stranger in the mirror. Rachel moved into a new apartment in an old building with a large, antique mirror hanging in the bedroom. She didn't think much of it until one night, when she noticed her reflection moving on its own. She watched, horrified, as her reflection grinned at her, though her own mouth remained still. As the nights went on, the reflection began doing more, waving when she wasn't, pointing at her, and even mouthing words she couldn't understand. One night, it stepped out of view entirely, leaving the mirror empty, just a blank expanse of glass. When she moved to cover the mirror, she felt a cold hand on her shoulder. She spun around, but no one was there. The next morning, the mirror was gone, and in its place was a message scratched into the wall. "Now, I'm on your side." Rachel left the apartment that day, but sometimes, when she looks into mirrors, she swears she sees someone else looking back. The endless hallway. Tom and his friends were exploring an abandoned asylum on Halloween night, daring each other to walk down the dark, crumbling hallways. One by one, they went through each floor until they found a long hallway at the very back of the building, its walls lined with peeling paint and broken windows. They dared Tom to walk all the way down and back, but as he started, he noticed the hallway seemed to stretch, growing longer and longer with each step. The lights flickered, casting strange shadows, and he could hear faint voices whispering, calling his name. He turned around, but his friends were gone, the entrance nowhere in sight. He ran, but the hallway stretched on endlessly, doors appearing and disappearing as he moved. Finally, he burst through a door, finding himself outside, alone, with no sign of the asylum or his friends. He tried to return. The building had vanished, leaving him to wonder if he'd ever really been there at all. The Headless Bride. In a small town in Tennessee, there's a legend about a bride who was killed on her wedding night, her life cut short by a jealous ex-lover. They say that every Halloween she roams the town, searching for her lost groom, her wedding dress stained with mud, and her veil trailing behind her like a ghostly shroud. One Halloween night, a local boy named Kevin was walking home when he saw a figure in a wedding dress standing under a street lamp. She turned towards him, her face hidden beneath the veil. He called out, asking if she needed help, but she didn't respond. Instead, she lifted her veil, revealing that she had no head. He ran, but she followed, her ghostly form gliding silently behind him. He barely made it home, locking the door behind him, but when he looked out the window, she was there, standing in his yard, waiting for him to come out. By morning, she was gone, but Kevin still sees her shadowy figure sometimes, lurking in the dark, searching for her groom. The girl in the cemetery. Maria had always been fascinated by the old cemetery near her home, so one Halloween night, she decided to explore it alone. She wandered between the gravestones, reading names and dates, feeling the weight of history around her. As she passed by a large, crumbling mausoleum, she heard soft sobbing coming from inside. Curious, she peered through the iron gate and saw a young girl, dressed in an old-fashioned white dress, sitting on the steps. Her face was buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking as she wept. Maria called out to her, asking if she was okay, but the girl didn't respond. She reached through the bars, trying to touch the girl's shoulder, but her hand passed through as if the girl were made of mist. Suddenly, the girl's head snapped up, her eyes hollow and black, her mouth twisted into a scream that echoed through the cemetery. Maria stumbled back, but the girl was gone, leaving only a faint wisp of fog behind. Maria ran, her heart pounding, and swore never to return. But some say that every Halloween, if you walk by the old mausoleum at midnight, you can still hear the sound of a young girl sobbing, waiting for someone to set her free. The Watcher on the Ridge. Charlie loved camping, and one Halloween, he decided to spend the night alone in the mountains. He found a secluded spot near a ridge with a beautiful view, set up his tent, and built a fire. As the sun set, a thick fog rolled in, wrapping around him like a shroud. As he sat by the fire, he saw a dark figure standing on the ridge above him, silhouetted against the fog. It was tall and motionless, watching him. He called out, but the figure didn't respond. He tried to ignore it, convincing himself it was just a tree or a trick of the light. But throughout the night, he could feel eyes on him, and every time he looked up, the figure was still there, a silent watcher, never moving, always staring. Finally, as dawn broke, he mustered the courage to climb the ridge, but when he reached the top, there was no sign of anyone. When he returned to his campsite, he found his belongings scattered and strange footprints circling his tent, large, clawed prints that led up to the ridge and then vanished. He left immediately, but the locals say that those who camp near the ridge on Halloween always feel as though they're being watched. The face in the television. Aiden's apartment building was old, the walls thin enough that he could hear his neighbors talking, even coughing. One Halloween night, he was watching TV, flipping through the channels, when he noticed a strange static screen with a face appearing briefly, then fading. Curious, he paused on the channel, thinking it was some old horror movie, but the face came back, clearer this time. A gaunt, pale face with sunken eyes staring directly at him, as if it could see him through the screen. Aiden quickly changed the channel, but the face followed, appearing on every channel, growing clearer each time. Then the face began to speak, whispering his name, its voice distorted, crackling with static. "I see you," it said, a cruel smile twisting its lips. Terrified, he turned the TV off, but the face remained, flickering on the darkened screen, its eyes locked onto his. The TV stayed off that night, but Aiden knew that every time he walked past it, he could feel that face watching him, waiting for the chance to speak again. He moved out shortly after, but the new tenants claim the TV turns itself on at night, showing a gaunt face with hollow eyes, whispering their names. The Restless Hands. Jack was restoring an old house he bought on a whim, an ancient building with creaky floors and dust-covered furniture. One Halloween, as he was working late into the night, he noticed handprints appearing on the walls, faint, grayish prints that seemed to be made by small, childlike hands. He tried cleaning them off, but more would appear, trailing along the walls, across the ceiling, and even on the windows. They were everywhere, growing more numerous each night, as if invisible children were running their hands along every surface. Then, one night, he heard giggling coming from the basement. He went down, flashlight in hand, and saw dozens of handprints on the walls, leading up to an old, rotting door. As he stepped closer, the giggling grew louder, and he saw small, shadowy hands reaching out from under the door, clawing at the floor, trying to pull it open. He slammed the door shut and ran, leaving the house that very night. But to this day, those who visit the house claim they can still hear the sound of tiny hands scratching from the other side of that basement door, waiting to be let out. The Vanishing Girl. While driving home one foggy Halloween night, Mark saw a young girl standing by the side of the road, looking lost and frightened. He pulled over, and she climbed into the car, thanking him in a quiet voice, saying she was trying to get home. As they drove, she gave him directions, leading him down twisting back roads that seemed to grow darker with each turn. Finally, they reached a small, run-down house. She thanked him again and got out, but as she walked toward the house, she turned and waved, her figure fading into the mist. Curious, Mark decided to knock on the door, but an old woman answered, looking weary and sad. When he asked about the girl, she began to cry, explaining that her daughter had died years ago in a car accident on Halloween night. She had been trying to get home ever since. He turned to look back, but the girl was gone, leaving only faint footprints in the mist. Now, every Halloween, he drives past the same spot, hoping never to see her again. The Crying Mannequin. Emma worked at a clothing store, and every Halloween, they would set up elaborate displays in the windows using old mannequins that had been in the store for decades. One night, she stayed late to finish setting up, arranging a mannequin dressed in a vintage suit by the front window. As she stepped back to admire her work, she noticed something strange. The mannequin had tears running down its cheeks, glistening in the dim light. She wiped them away, thinking it was just a trick of the light, but more appeared, streaming down its face as if it was silently crying. She checked the mannequin's face, but it was just cold, unyielding plastic. Then she heard a faint whisper, a man's voice murmuring, "Please, help me." She looked around, but no one else was there. The next morning, the mannequin was gone, and no one else in the store seemed to remember it. Emma transferred to another store shortly after, but she still has nightmares of mannequins with human faces, their eyes filled with tears, watching her silently, waiting for someone to listen to their cries. The Room That Changed. Sophie rented a room in an old boarding house while she looked for a permanent place to live. The room was small and nondescript, with a single bed, a dresser, and a cracked mirror. But every morning, she woke up to find the room slightly different. Sometimes the bed would be in the opposite corner, or the mirror would be cracked in a new pattern. One night, she set up her phone to record while she slept, hoping to catch whatever was moving her things. When she reviewed the footage the next day, she saw herself sleeping peacefully. Until 3 a.m. at that moment, the walls began to shift, rippling like water, and dark shadows filled the room, reaching out with long, clawed fingers that brushed against her face as she slept. The shadows reformed into strange shapes, twisting the room into a nightmare version of itself, filled with skeletal hands clawing at the walls and eyes watching from every corner. At 4 a.m., everything returned to normal, and Sophie remained asleep, unaware of what had happened around her. She left that day, but the boarding house owner claimed the room has always been special. He never explained why, but those who stay there say the walls seem to breathe, as if the room itself were alive, waiting for the right person to keep forever. The mirror that reflected nothing. Mason had a strange obsession with mirrors and spent years collecting them from antique shops and estate sales. One Halloween, he found a beautiful ornate mirror with a dark, polished frame at a local flea market. He eagerly brought it home, hanging it in his living room. That night, he noticed something odd. While every other object in the room was reflected in the mirror, he wasn't. He stood in front of it, waving his arms, but the mirror remained empty, as though he weren't there. Puzzled, he tried touching the glass, but his hand passed through, meeting only cold air. He backed away, watching as the mirror filled with a dark fog, and then his own reflection appeared, grinning maliciously. The reflection began to speak, mocking him, revealing secrets only he knew. Horrified, he covered the mirror and hid it in the attic, hoping to forget about it. But every morning, he'd find the mirror back in the living room, uncovered, with his twisted reflection grinning back at him. Mason eventually moved, leaving the mirror behind, but sometimes he still dreams of it, of the dark fog and the reflection that knows too much. The doll in the hotel room. Jenny was traveling alone on a business trip, staying at an old hotel in the heart of a small town. She arrived late and was given the last available room, a quaint but slightly run-down suite on the top floor. As she unpacked, she noticed a small porcelain doll sitting on the chair in the corner. Its eyes were wide and unblinking, with a permanent, unsettling grin. She called the front desk to ask about the doll, but they assured her the room had been thoroughly cleaned and there should be no doll there. Puzzled, she moved the doll to the closet and tried to ignore it. That night, she was woken by a soft rustling sound. She turned on the light and saw the doll sitting on the chair again, its head tilted slightly as if it were watching her. She put it in the bathroom, shutting the door, and tried to go back to sleep. But she woke again to the same rustling sound, and the doll was back on the chair, closer to the bed this time, with its arms stretched out towards her. She left the hotel that night, barely stopping to grab her things. Later, she discovered that the hotel had a history. A young girl had died in that very room decades ago, and her favorite doll was rumored to reappear, watching over those who dared to stay in her room. The Lake of Lost Souls. In a small town, there's a lake known for strange disappearances. The locals call it the Lake of Lost Souls, and it's rumored that on Halloween night, if you stand by the shore, you'll see the faces of those who vanished there, just beneath the water's surface. Liam and his friends decided to test the legend, gathering by the lake as the clock struck midnight. The water was eerily still, a thick mist hanging just above its surface. They watched in silence, their flashlights barely piercing the darkness. Suddenly, one of them gasped. Faces began to appear in the water, pale and ghostly, their eyes wide and filled with terror. The faces seemed to call to them, their mouths opening and closing as if begging for help. One of the friends, entranced, reached out, his hands skimming the water's surface. In an instant, icy hands shot out, pulling him under before anyone could react. The others screamed, but it was too late. He was gone, leaving only ripples on the water. They fled, but no one ever saw their friend again. The lake remains still and silent, waiting for the next visitor to join its collection of lost souls. The Whispering Mask. Sam loved collecting unusual artifacts, and one Halloween, he found an old, intricately carved mask at a flea market. The vendor claimed it was haunted, but Sam laughed it off, thinking it was just a scare tactic to sell the mask. He brought it home and hung it on his wall, admiring its strange, almost lifelike features. That night, he began to hear faint whispers, like voices murmuring just out of reach. He wandered around his apartment, trying to find the source, but it always seemed to come from the mask. He thought it was just his imagination, but as he turned to walk away, he heard a clear, chilling voice call his name. He turned back and saw that the mask's eyes were glowing faintly, and its lips had twisted into a wicked grin. The whispers grew louder, filling his head with dark thoughts, urging him to put the mask on. He felt drawn to it, compelled to obey, his hand reaching out despite his terror. At the last moment, he ripped the mask from the wall, threw it into the fireplace, and watched as the flames devoured it. But every night since, he can still hear faint whispers, as if the mask had left a part of itself behind, waiting for him to invite it back. The empty grave. Sarah and her friends decided to explore an abandoned cemetery on Halloween night, armed with flashlights and a sense of adventure. They wandered between the crumbling headstones, reading the names and dates, each one older than the last. Then they came upon a grave that had been dug up, the coffin inside broken and empty. Curious, they leaned closer, peering into the darkness. One of her friends dared her to climb inside, and she reluctantly agreed, laughing as she lowered herself into the grave. But as she stood there, a chill ran down her spine. She felt something cold wrap around her ankle, holding her in place. She screamed and scrambled out, but the moment she was free, they heard a low guttural voice echo from the empty grave, saying, "Come back, it's so lonely down here." Terrified they ran, but when they turned back, they saw a dark figure climbing out of the grave, watching them with hollow, empty eyes. Sarah never went back to the cemetery, but sometimes she dreams of the grave, of cold hands reaching for her, waiting for her to return. The vanishing neighbor. Jake moved into a new apartment, a small but cozy unit in an old building. His next-door neighbor was an elderly woman who kept to herself, rarely leaving her apartment. He often heard her humming softly through the walls, a strange, haunting melody that echoed late into the night. One Halloween, he realized he hadn't seen or heard her in a while, so he decided to check on her. He knocked on her door, but there was no answer. Worried, he called the building manager, who informed him that the apartment had been empty for years. The woman who lived there had passed away long ago. Shaken, he returned to his apartment, but that night he heard the familiar humming, clear and close, as if she was standing right beside him. He turned and saw her standing in his doorway, her eyes hollow, her face twisted into a mournful expression. He moved out the next day, but neighbors claim they still hear her humming through the walls, a melody that never fades, as if she's still waiting for someone to hear her. The Curse of the Black Cat. On Halloween night, Ben was driving home when a black cat darted across the road. He swerved, barely missing it, and watched as it stopped, staring back at him with piercing yellow eyes. Thinking it was just a stray, he drove on, but when he arrived home, the same cat was sitting on his doorstep, waiting for him. Over the next few days, the cat appeared everywhere he went, outside his office, in the grocery store parking lot, even on his bedroom windowsill at night. No matter where he went, the cat followed, its eyes watching him, unblinking. One night, he woke up to find the cat sitting at the foot of his bed, a dark figure with eyes glowing like embers. He tried to shoo it away, but it only hissed, its form growing larger, twisting into a shadowy creature with long claws and a sinister grin. The next morning, he found scratches on his arms, as if he'd been attacked by something in his sleep. He left town that day, but the cat followed, appearing in every new place he tried to hide. Now he spends his days running, haunted by the black cat that never lets him escape. The Mirror in the Forest. A couple went camping in the deep woods, far from civilization, hoping for a peaceful weekend. As they explored the area, they came upon a large old mirror propped up against a tree, its glass cracked and weathered. Curious, they approached it, noticing their reflections distorted, as if the mirror were warping their faces. They decided to leave, but as they turned away, they heard footsteps behind them. When they looked back, their reflections were still in the mirror, staring at them, even though they had moved. The reflections began to smile, their expressions growing more twisted and malevolent with each passing second. Panicking, they ran back to their campsite, but all night they could hear voices whispering from the trees, calling their names, urging them to look back at the mirror. By morning, they packed up and left, but they never forgot the feeling that something was following them, something with their own faces, waiting for a chance to take their place. The Wailing Woman of the Bridge. In a small town, there's an old rickety bridge where people claim to hear the cries of a woman late at night. Local legend says she lost her child in the river below and has been searching for him ever since, her spirit unable to move on. Every Halloween, she appears, wandering the bridge, crying for her lost child. One Halloween night, a group of friends dared each other to cross the bridge. As they reached the middle, they heard a soft, mournful wail coming from beneath them. They looked over the edge and saw a figure in the water, a woman with long, tangled hair, reaching up as if begging for help. Suddenly, she appeared on the bridge before them, her eyes filled with sorrow, her hands outstretched. She whispered, "Have you seen my child?" and moved toward them, her face twisted with grief and anger. They ran, but one of them tripped, and when he looked back, she was gone, leaving only a faint, icy mist that lingered on the bridge. They returned to town, vowing never to speak of what they'd seen, but locals claim that if you cross the bridge on Halloween, you'll hear her voice calling for her child, growing louder until she finds you. The Phantom Lanterns. In a secluded part of the countryside, there's a field known for strange sightings on Halloween night. People say that if you walk through it at midnight, you'll see ghostly lanterns floating in the air, leading the way to an unknown destination. James and his friends decided to investigate, venturing into the field just as the clock struck 12. Sure enough, they saw small, flickering lights appearing in the distance, floating closer and closer, like lanterns carried by invisible hands. They followed the lights, feeling drawn, as if something were guiding them. Suddenly, the lanterns vanished, and they found themselves standing in the middle of an ancient, forgotten graveyard, the air thick with the scent of decay. Shadows moved among the graves, and they realized they were surrounded by spectral figures, each one holding a lantern, their faces pale and hollow. The figures began to close in, their lanterns casting eerie shadows as they reached out, beckoning the group to stay. James and his friends ran, but as they left the field, they looked back and saw the lanterns hovering in the air, a final warning to those who dared to return. The Howling Windmill. In a small, isolated town, there is an old windmill that has been abandoned for decades. Locals say that on Halloween night, the windmill's blades begin to turn, even if there's no wind, and a mournful howling sound echoes from within. Few dare to go near it, but every Halloween, someone is brave or foolish enough to try. One year, a teenager named Kyle decided to investigate. He climbed through the broken fence and made his way to the base of the windmill, his flashlight cutting through the thick fog. The blades creaked as they turned, and he could hear faint whispers mingling with the howling wind. He climbed the rickety stairs inside, feeling a strange compulsion pulling him higher and higher. When he reached the top, he found a small, dusty room with old tools and rotting wood. But in the corner stood a shadowy figure, tall and thin, with glowing eyes. The figure pointed to the open window, and suddenly, Kyle felt a strong gust of wind pushing him towards it. He managed to pull away, stumbling down the stairs and out of the windmill. As he looked back, he saw the figure watching him from the top, a ghostly smile on its face. Now, every Halloween, Kyle hears the windmills howling in his dreams, calling him back, waiting for him to finish the climb. The Haunted Church Bell. In the heart of a ghost town lies an old church, its steeple towering over the empty buildings. The townspeople abandoned it long ago, but on Halloween night, the church bell rings, echoing through the deserted streets as if summoning lost souls. One Halloween, a group of friends decided to find out who or what was ringing the bell. They made their way to the church, finding the heavy doors unlocked and the interior filled with broken pews and shattered stained glass. The bell tower loomed above, and they began the climb, each step creaking beneath them. When they reached the top, they found the bell swaying, though there was no wind. As they watched, it began to toll, a deep, resonant sound that shook the entire church. They looked around, but no one was there. Then they heard footsteps behind them, slow and deliberate, and turned to see a ghostly figure in a tattered choir robe, holding a cracked bell in one hand. The figure raised the bell, and the sound grew louder, reverberating through their bones. They'd fled down the tower, but as they left the church, they saw more figures emerging from the shadows, drawn by the sound of the bell. They barely escaped, and now they warn others never to visit the church on Halloween, lest they too be summoned by the haunting toll. The Bleeding Walls. Alex and his family moved into an old Victorian house, thrilled to have found such a beautiful home at a bargain price. The previous owners had left in a hurry, but they didn't think much of it. However, on Halloween night, they began to hear strange noises, scratching sounds and faint whispers that seemed to come from the walls. As the night wore on, Alex noticed a dark red stain seeping from a crack in the living room wall. He wiped it away, but the stain grew larger, spreading across the wallpaper. Soon, it was oozing from every wall in the house, a thick, sticky substance that smelled faintly of iron. Terrified, they tried to leave, but the doors wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, turning into screams, and the walls began to shake, as if something were trapped inside, trying to break free. Finally, as dawn approached, the doors unlocked, and they escaped. The next family that moved in found the walls freshly painted, but every Halloween the red stains return and the whispers begin again, a reminder of the horrors hidden within the house's walls. The Forest of the Forgotten. In a remote part of the countryside, there is a forest where people often go missing, lured by strange lights and distant music. It's known as the Forest of the Forgotten, and those who enter on Halloween night are said to vanish, never to be seen again. Desperate for adventure, a group of friends decided to explore it, following the faint glow of lanterns and the haunting sound of an old forgotten melody. The deeper they went, the thicker the mist became, obscuring their path and isolating them from one another. One by one, they disappeared until only one remained. She called out, but all she heard was the sound of laughter echoing through the trees. Then she saw them, her friends, standing in a circle, their faces blank and their eyes empty. They reached out to her, their hands cold and stiff, pulling her into the darkness. The next morning, search parties found no trace of them. But every Halloween, people claimed to see ghostly figures wandering the edge of the forest, as if searching for a way back to the world they left behind. The Phantom Passenger. Tara was driving home late one Halloween night when she saw a man standing by the side of the road, his arm raised, thumb out, hitchhiking. Against her better judgment, she stopped and let him in. He was dressed in old, worn clothes, his face pale and expressionless, and he barely spoke a word as she drove. After a while, she noticed he was staring at her in the rearview mirror, his eyes dark and hollow. She tried to make small talk, but he remained silent, his gaze fixed on her. Suddenly, she realized he wasn't sitting in the back seat anymore. He was gone, as if he had never been there. Shaken, she continued driving, but she felt a cold hand brush her shoulder, and his voice echoed in her ear, whispering, "Thank you for the ride." She looked back, and there he was, sitting in the back seat, grinning at her. She slammed on the brakes, and he vanished again, leaving only a faint, icy mist. Since that night, she's avoided driving alone on Halloween, but sometimes she sees his face in her rearview mirror, watching, waiting for another ride. The candle that won't go out. In an old, abandoned mansion, there is a single candle that never goes out, no matter how hard anyone tries to extinguish it. Locals say that the mansion is haunted, and the candle holds the restless spirit of a woman who died there under mysterious circumstances. One Halloween, a group of thrill-seekers dared each other to blow out the candle, hoping to put the legend to rest. They entered the mansion, finding the candle on a dusty table in the center of the room, its flame flickering gently. One by one, they tried to blow it out, but the flame remained, growing brighter with each attempt. As they continued, they heard soft, mournful singing, filling the room with a haunting melody. The walls began to bleed shadows, and the air grew thick with a sense of dread. Finally, the last person in the group made one final attempt, and the candle went out, plunging the room into darkness. But then they heard footsteps approaching, and a voice whispered, "Thank you, now I'm free." The candle relit itself, casting a ghostly light on the figure of a woman standing in the doorway, her face twisted with rage. They ran, but the candle has remained lit ever since, its flame brighter, waiting for the next group to try and set her free. The Haunted Ferris Wheel. There's an abandoned amusement park on the edge of town, closed down after a series of tragic accidents. The Ferris wheel, towering above the ruins, still stands, its rusted metal creaking in the wind. Locals say that on Halloween night, the Ferris wheel comes to life, spinning slowly in the darkness, as if welcoming lost souls. One Halloween, two friends sneaked into the park, daring each other to ride the Ferris wheel. They climbed into one of the creaking seats, and to their surprise, the wheel began to move, lifting them higher and higher, giving them a view of the empty park below. But as they reached the top, they felt a cold hand grab their shoulders, and they turned to see shadowy figures sitting beside them, their faces twisted and ghostly. The figures began to laugh, a hollow, echoing sound, and the wheel started spinning faster and faster, trapping them in an endless loop. They finally escaped, but not without scars, both physical and mental. Now, every Halloween, people hear the sound of laughter echoing from the Ferris wheel, as if the spirits of the past are still trapped, waiting for someone to join them on their endless ride. The mirror that shows the future. In a small, forgotten antique shop, there's a mirror rumored to show people how they will die. No one knows where it came from, but the shop owner warns anyone who enters to stay away from it, especially on Halloween, when its powers are strongest. One Halloween, a young man named Leo ignored the warnings and looked into the mirror, hoping to see his future. At first, he saw nothing but his own reflection, but slowly, the image began to change. He saw himself standing alone in a dark room, blood dripping from his hands, surrounded by shadowy figures. As he watched, the figures advanced, their faces blank and featureless, their hands reaching out to him. He tried to look away, but his gaze was locked, and the mirror began to crack, splintering into a web of fractures. He finally broke free, but when he turned away, he found himself in the same dark room he'd seen in the mirror, the shadows closing in on him. The shop owner found the mirror shattered the next day, but Leah was nowhere to be found. Now, anyone who looks into the mirror on Halloween night claims to see him standing behind them, his eyes filled with terror, warning them to turn back before it's too late. The Ghostly Guide. In the heart of a historic town, there is an old cobblestone alleyway that twists and turns, leading to nowhere. Locals say that on Halloween night, a ghostly guide appears, offering to show lost souls the way home. But those who follow him are never seen again. One Halloween, a woman named Nora got lost after a party, wandering into the alleyway by mistake. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see a man in a long coat, his face hidden in shadow. He offered to guide her back, his voice smooth and reassuring, and she, relieved, followed him. But as they walked, the alleyway grew darker, the buildings around them twisting into strange, unnatural shapes. She felt a growing sense of dread, but the man urged her on, his hand cold as he led her deeper into the darkness. Finally, they reached a dead end, and he turned to face her, his face a hollow skull, his eyes glowing with a sinister light. He whispered, "Welcome home," and the walls closed in, trapping her forever in the twisting maze. The next morning, no one could find any trace of her, but those who walk the alley on Halloween claim they sometimes hear her voice, calling for help, lost in the endless darkness. The House That Eats Memories. There is a house at the end of a forgotten road, hidden by overgrown trees and shadows. Those who enter say that the house is alive, feeding on the memories of those who dare to walk its halls. Every Halloween, it draws people in, promising hidden treasures and secrets, but they always leave changed, or not at all. One Halloween, a man named Victor decided to explore it, hoping to solve the mystery. As he wandered through the empty rooms, he felt strange, as if he were losing pieces of himself. He saw flashes of his past, moments slipping away, fading as the house absorbed them. Desperate to escape, he ran for the door, but it was too late. He couldn't remember his name, his face, even why he had come. The house had taken everything, leaving him a hollow shell, a shadow of who he once was. Now he wanders the house on Halloween, a ghost trapped in the walls, watching for others to feed the house's hunger. Those who escape claim they can feel his presence, a cold, empty figure watching, waiting for someone else to join him. The Staircase to Nowhere. In an old library on the outskirts of a small town, there is a staircase that leads to nowhere. Hidden behind a door labeled storage, the staircase is narrow, spiraling up and up with no end in sight. Most of the staff avoids it, but one Halloween night, a young librarian named Rebecca decided to explore it, hoping to uncover its secrets. She climbed, the air growing colder with each step, the light fading as she ascended. She soon realized that the staircase seemed endless, winding higher and higher, with no doors or landings in sight. Just as she began to feel lost, she heard footsteps echoing from above, slow and steady, descending toward her. Rebecca called out, but there was no response. She tried to turn back, but the stairs seemed different, twisting in impossible ways, leading her deeper into the darkness. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and she could feel a presence just beyond her reach, something unseen lurking in the shadows. She was never seen again, and the library has since closed off the door, leaving the staircase to its secrets. But every so often, the staff hears the faint sound of footsteps coming from beyond the locked door, as if someone, or something, is still wandering, lost in the darkness. The Closet with the Blue Light. Cassie moved into a cozy, old-fashioned house on the outskirts of town, excited to have a place of her own. But on her first night, she noticed a faint blue light coming from the closet in her bedroom. She opened the door to investigate, only to find nothing but old wallpaper peeling from the walls and a musty smell that hinted at years of neglect. However, each night, the blue light returned, stronger and more intense. She tried ignoring it, but eventually, her curiosity got the better of her. She opened the closet one night to find a small, glowing object embedded in the wall, its faint blue light pulsating as if alive. She reached out to touch it, and the room instantly grew cold, her breath visible in the air. Suddenly, she heard a child's voice whisper, "Come closer." She recoiled, slamming the closet door shut, but the whispering continued, growing louder and more insistent each night. The blue light seeped through the cracks around the door, filling her room with an eerie glow. Cassie moved out shortly after, but she heard that the next tenant claimed to see the same light and hear the same chilling whispers. It seems that whatever is in the closet is still waiting for someone to come closer. The phantom child at the playground. Paul loved going for late-night walks, especially on cool autumn nights. One Halloween, he decided to stroll through the local park, passing by the small playground that was usually empty at night. But this time, he saw a young girl on the swings, her head hanging low, swinging slowly back and forth. He approached her, concerned, and asked if she was lost. The girl didn't respond, just kept swinging, her movements slow and mechanical. As he moved closer, he noticed that she was wearing a white dress, thin and tattered, and her skin had an almost translucent quality to it, glowing faintly in the moonlight. He reached out to touch her shoulder, and she suddenly looked up, her face pale and expressionless, her eyes empty black pits. She whispered, "Want to play with me?" before dissolving into a wisp of fog that drifted away on the breeze. Paul ran from the park, but every Halloween, he swears he sees her swinging alone, waiting for someone to come play. The possessed painting. Ella was an artist with a passion for the strange and the macabre. She often visited thrift stores to find inspiration, and one Halloween, she came across an old, battered painting of a dark forest, cloaked in fog. She was drawn to it immediately and bought it, planning to restore it and hang it in her studio. As she worked on the painting, strange things began to happen. Shadows seemed to stretch across her walls, and she would catch glimpses of figures moving within the trees in the painting. One night, as she was cleaning her brushes, she looked up to see a pair of glowing eyes staring back at her from the canvas. Horrified, she tried to cover the painting, but the eyes followed her, growing more intense, as if the figure were pushing against the frame, trying to break free. The room grew icy, and she could feel a dark presence behind her, breathing heavily. She abandoned her studio that night, leaving the painting behind. When she returned the next day, it was gone. Rumor has it that the painting reappears in various thrift stores, waiting for someone else to take it home, and those who do are never heard from again. The ghostly hitchhiker. Sam was driving home from a Halloween party, the road empty and bathed in an eerie mist. As he rounded a corner, he saw a figure standing by the side of the road, a woman in a long flowing dress, her face hidden by a hood. She raised a hand, motioning for him to stop. He pulled over, and she got into the back seat without a word. She looked cold, her skin almost blue, and he asked if she needed help. She simply nodded, staring out the window as he drove. After a few minutes, he looked in the rearview mirror, only to find the back seat empty. Startled, he pulled over, but there was no sign of her. Just as he was about to drive off, he felt a chill and heard her voice whisper from the back seat, "Thank you for the ride." He spun around, but the seat was still empty. Shaken, he drove home and learned later that a woman fitting her description had died on that very stretch of road years ago. Now she appears every Halloween, looking for a ride to her final destination. The figure in the fog. Melissa went for a run every morning through the foggy trails near her home. One morning, just before dawn, she saw a dark figure standing by the edge of the woods, barely visible through the mist. It looked like a man, tall and thin, dressed in dark clothing, his face hidden in shadow. She continued running, but each time she looked over her shoulder, the figure was there, always the same distance away, always watching. She picked up her pace. The faster she ran, the closer he seemed to get, until he was nearly beside her, his face turning slowly to reveal hollow, empty eyes and a crooked smile. She stumbled, falling to the ground, and when she looked up, he was gone, leaving nothing but a strange, swirling mist. She ran home, never daring to take that trail again. But sometimes, when she passes by the edge of the woods, she catches a glimpse of him standing there, waiting for someone else to run by. The shadow in the hallway. A young woman named Tara recently moved into an older apartment building in Chicago. She was thrilled to finally be living alone, but her excitement quickly gave way to unease. Every night, around 3 a.m., she would hear slow, shuffling footsteps in the hallway outside her bedroom door. The sound would linger for several minutes before fading, but each night it got closer, as if someone were gradually making their way toward her room. One night, determined to catch whatever was making the noise, Tara left her bedroom door slightly open. She waited, phone in hand, ready to record what she saw. At exactly 3 a.m., the footsteps started again, slow and heavy, scraping along the floor. As they neared her door, a dark shape appeared, just a shadow, darker than the rest of the room, but it was clearly the outline of a person. She froze.